I am Dore, the president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Jonathan is from the Federation for the Defense of Democracies. I believe he is the deputy head of that organization. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Senior Vice President for FDD.
Okay, senior. I knew there was a vice president in there. So, and we are going to really get into his new book, Gaza Conflict 2021. And I went up to my study just the other day and I saw books that I have that various people wrote after previous Gaza conflicts, some of which I was more engaged in than others. And I was just saying to Jonathan, one thing that stands out about his book, and I hope everyone understands this, if you know nothing about the Arab-Israel conflict and all you read is Jonathan Schanzer's book, you will be up to speed very quickly. Because what he manages to do with this book is reach into all the dimensions of the conflict. And so it's not just a book about the latest technical device, you know, the latest Iron Dome system that intercepts at this speed as opposed to that speed. No. You get the flavor of the dimensions of the conflict. You get the flavor, for example, of Turkey's role in hosting Hamas, which I've been dealing with in something I'm writing at present. So it's really an important book, and I hope those who study the Arab-Israel conflict, if there are still people who do that, I hope they will buy his book and read it, because I think it really does the job. And with that, I'm going to open with a question, but we're going to really do a variety of subjects here. You know, people who look back on the Gaza conflict identify different dimensions. This is particularly perhaps a Palestinian perception. They like to speak about the land conflicts in Jerusalem. They like to speak about the conflict over the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And then eventually they get to what was going on in the Gaza Strip. If you do the first two, you obviously tilt the discourse in a pro-Palestinian direction. But when you started gathering material for this book, Jonathan, how did you sense the interaction between these different dimensions?
So it's a good question. And first of all, thank you for hosting me today. Thank you for the kind words on the book, and really want to just tell you how much I appreciated working with you when you were serving Israel in an official capacity and also in your current role. So thank you very much for the opportunity today. The reason why I wrote the book was because I decided to cover the war from my home here in suburban Washington, D.C. I was able to watch the war unfold on television in real time. The technology that's available today is different than the previous 3 rounds of the war. So I was able to watch it more carefully, and that certainly contributed to my decision to ultimately write the book. But you know, in terms of that background, you know, just even looking at the outbreak of the conflict itself, I think is an important point to start from. The way that it was described here in our media, here in the United States, was that there was a real estate conflict in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Eastern Jerusalem, that Precisely. Israel was about to evict some poor and helpless Palestinians, and that was the reason for the war. And actually, you'll still see descriptions along those lines today. First, let me just say how ridiculous that sounds on its face, because of course, real estate conflicts don't cause wars. Guns cause wars, missiles cause wars, rockets cause wars, bombings cause wars. And we know how that played out during the Gaza conflict of May 2021. Hamas decided to start firing rockets into the environs of Jerusalem, and that prompted Israel to respond in kind. But let's just take another step back for a minute and acknowledge the fact that the real estate conflict in question was effectively almost a century old. We're talking about homes that Jews bought pre-1948 Israel, and then they lost control of that territory between 1948 and 1967 when Jordan occupied East Jerusalem. And then after the Israelis assumed control of this area, they didn't evict the Palestinians, but rather began a legal process, which is still, by the way, winding its way through the courts and going through the process to this day. So this idea that somehow it was, Israeli policy that was putting Palestinians' backs up against the wall was erroneous to begin with and highly problematic. But the other thing that I found so problematic about the description of the war itself, you talked about kind of a pro-Palestinian perspective. Well, what about just taking a Palestinian-centric perspective for a minute and noting that in April, 1 month before the war last year, there was a decision taken on the part of Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian Authority, to cancel the Palestinian elections. Now, this was a decision that had been undertaken right after the signing of the Abraham Accords, actually, where the Palestinians realized that getting their political house in order, unifying politically, would be to their best interest because they had clearly lost the hearts and minds of the rest of the Arab world. And it was based on that decision that they moved forward with those elections. But the closer we got to the elections, the more nervous we saw Arab states, we saw Israel, and certainly by the end, the United States was signaling that it would have been a bad idea to have Hamas take part in those elections because, of course, Hamas is a terrorist organization that could not be legitimized or should not be legitimized. And so ultimately, Hamas was jettisoned from this political process. And in my view, they saw no other recourse but to try to win the hearts and minds of the Palestinians by other means. And for Hamas, other means is just really one way, and that is through violence. And if you're trying to put a finger on why that conflict erupted, I think it really stemmed more from Hamas's exclusion from the political process and not this real estate conflict, which I think too often was pointed to as the genesis here in the United States.
Well, I agree with that. There's an Arabic word that the Hamas uses, and it appears in its charter, mukawama, resistance. And that is what they were, selling the Palestinian public. And you mentioned the Arab states that Israel had normalization agreements with. When I moved from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs back to my think tank, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, I decided that I would try to sign cooperation agreements with think tanks in the Arab world. And we had started doing that when I was, before I became the Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we accelerated that process. Now, I'm saying that because when you go to Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates, or you go to Bahrain, these countries have a real problem with Hamas. And they are facing, for example, in the case of Bahrain, they're facing a Iranian-backed resistance, which is fighting them and I would say hitting Bahrain almost on a daily basis. It's not reported, but I was just in Bahrain and I met with their security people. And I was floored to see that you're talking about daily attacks. And of course, we've all seen in the case of the United Arab Emirates that the Houthi fighters who have been lobbing missiles into the heart of Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, are now extending their attacks into the United Arab Emirates itself. So these guys have all been dealing with so-called resistance organizations, which are actually terrorist organizations. And it's not surprising to find that Hamas is defined as a terrorist organization by Egypt, by the UAE, and by Bahrain. And, Israel is really on the same side as a number of Arab states on these conflicts. And of course, Hamas is backed by Iran. So, that completes the circle about who's with who and who's on whose side.
It does. And I would, maybe take all of that a step further. I mean, one, you mentioned Bahrain. For anyone who's been fortunate enough to visit Bahrain, their Ministry of Interior will pull out a lot of the weapons that they've confiscated over the years.
So you had to tour.
Yeah, I did. And one of the things that struck me, it was really amazing. They lay out the weapons, and it reminded me, especially the projectiles, and it really reminded me of tours that you could get on the border with Gaza. The same sort of thing where, the missiles or rockets, the Qassams that were exploded, the weapons that had been confiscated on the border. It was almost like a verbatim presentation. You hear, by the way, all of these countries, when they talk about having to fight against Iran-backed militias, they talk about how it's a tough neighborhood and it's difficult to deal with the Iranians. And that's, of course, a common refrain that you hear in Israel. And so it, really dating back 3, 4, 5 years ago, well before the Abraham Accords, I began to note the similarities in the discussion. Certainly you're seeing right now a frustration building on the part of the Saudis in particular, and more recently the UAE, as they've come under fire by the Houthis, that here you have a terrorist organization that's backed and funded and trained and financed by Iran. And you see a paralysis on the part of the international community, a paralysis on the part of US policy, where we're willing to condemn, but only condemn, and not really take it a step further and leave them to their own devices. So you see a lot of that same sort of frustration boiling over in the Gulf. I think it, to a certain extent, explains what happened with the signing of the Abraham Accords. But one thing that I'll just note, and I did address this in the book, was that the Gaza war of last year was really a stress test. It was the first stress test for these new relationships. And I have to say, I was a bit concerned when the war erupted. Social media, if you saw in Arabic, there were a lot of hashtags and sort of trend lines that we saw, where there was a lot of criticism being leveled at Israel, once again, for a war that Israel didn't start against an Iranian proxy. So there was, I think, real cause for concern that, we might see some real cracks emerge in these relationships. But what I saw over the course of those 11 days gave me, I think, a lot of confidence in the staying power of these relationships. Because what happened is that ultimately these regimes began to issue some of their own messaging about what was happening in the Gaza Strip, reminding people that this was something that was not happening on their doorstep, but rather that it was taking place a half a world away. And it's hard, I think, for people to remember that. But really the key here was that at the end of all of it, there was a sense of relief on the part of everyone, the Israelis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, and even countries like Saudi Arabia, which have not yet made peace with Israel, but I think are certainly mulling it. I think there was a sense of relief that things would be able to go back to normal, that 11 days was something that they could countenance as long as they could get back to where they were. And so anyway, I think the end result was that things were calm, or calmer than they had been in the past. When I watched Al Arabiya, for example, it used to be that you'd watch the coverage of these Gaza wars, and it was vitriolic, the coverage, right? Really vilifying the Israelis. What I saw this time around was much more muted coverage, in some cases, a drop in coverage entirely, right? Where you maybe at the top of the hour circle back and get a 5-minute update. But rather than having the whole hour devoted to the war, they went on and talked about other things that were happening in the world. And I think understanding that that is the way that the Gulf countries are going to be approaching this, I think is a good bellwether for what we might see in the future.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I was very concerned that these new relationships would snap and they wouldn't hold out. And when I myself went to both of those countries, both to the UAE and to Bahrain, and rather than being shown the way to the door, I was accepted, and the discussions were deep, and the mutual identification of challenges was full. I think that led me to much more comfort about the future of these relationships. And we have to invest time and effort. We have to visit these countries. We have to invite them to our research centers as well. But I think that I think we came out of this conflict, which was unfair, which was unjust on the part of Hamas. We came out stronger, and I think that's a good thing.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, again, that's being reflected right now in the resumption of the warm ties that we see, and again, I think as I think you highlighted, the knowledge that their primary enemies in the region are Iranian proxies, and in fact Iran itself, I think is only going to strengthen the ties over time, and that I think really does get to a key element that was lost here in the United States, that this was not just simply an extension of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This was not the war of 48, 67, 73, et cetera, et cetera. We know the history of Israel. We know the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict, as we know it, is shrinking. I don't want to say it's gone. Certainly there are still holdouts in the Arab world that still vilify Israel and seek war with Israel. But I think as a result of the Abraham Accords and other trends that we're watching across the region, there is less cause to point to the broader Arab-Israeli conflict today than there has been in maybe ever. I mean, I don't know if we can point to it as the same conflict any longer. What we look at now are two different conflicts that have emerged. And by the way, I don't even know if we can call it the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, right? Because if you looked at what happened in the West Bank, it was relatively quiet during this most recent war. It's the Gaza-Israel conflict. And there, I think we need to point it to two factors. One is Hamas itself, which is a splinter group of the Muslim Brotherhood born in the late 1980s, and then ultimately embraced by Iran. And Iran is today still its most significant funder and supporter. But what we're talking about now are two basic, they're proxy wars. One that is being carried out by Iran against Israel. And we see it, by the way, not just with Hamas, but with Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah and even Shiite militias in places like Syria. So that is one element of the conflict, I think grossly underanalyzed when wars erupt. And then the other one is the Muslim Brotherhood Israeli conflict. And there we can point to two supporters of Hamas, one being the country of Qatar and the other being the country of Turkey. Both of them continue to provide support to Hamas, maybe not direct support in terms of military assistance, but financial assistance, diplomatic assistance, political assistance. And so when you look at what enabled Hamas to wage this conflict, what enabled Hamas to continue to wage it after its eruption, we can go back to those three patrons primarily, and that got very little attention during the conflict itself.
Well, I think, you know, there are also patrons that we're hoping to diplomatically pull to our side. Qatar is a hard nut to crack, and I don't see something changing there. Turkey, we're right now in the middle of a dance between Israel and Erdogan, a dance which is intended to bring these countries together. I don't know, maybe if the price is too high, you know, the Biden administration just canceled one of the most important gas pipelines in energy history of the Middle East. I'm speaking about the Mediterranean pipeline that was supposed to move Israeli gas, Cypriot gas, up to Greece, and then across to Italy and into Europe. And it's not a cheap pipeline, it's very expensive. But considering the costs of other pipelines for European energy needs, this was something that was conceivable. And unfortunately, the rug was pulled out under this from under this project. And right now, it looks like we've lost it. But why am I going into details about gas pipelines? Because there is a school of thought that preferred Turkey as a conduit for gas and not Greece and the pipeline that Israel and the Greeks had agreed upon. So we have a reflection of our struggle with the Muslim Brotherhood in terms of our northern neighbor. And we're hoping that northern neighbor changes orientation, but I'm not sure that's going to happen.
Yeah, unfortunately, Dore, I don't see it. We have a fairly robust program that has looked into Turkey over the last decade. And there, I think it's only apt to just say that it's been a steady unraveling of the U.S.-Turkey relationship. I think it's been an unraveling of the NATO-Turkey relationship. Increasingly, I would argue that Turkey doesn't belong in NATO, that it is a Muslim Brotherhood Islamist government that has become increasingly anti-American, anti-Western, and certainly anti-Israeli over the years. Some of the things that I'd point to as part of that unraveling, just even looking at the rise of ISIS, most people don't think about Turkey's role in that. But, when people would find their way to fight in Syria, they would often buy tickets to Istanbul, make their way east, and then cross over into the border with Syria. Really, with the border guards in Turkey would turn a blind eye to this activity. They saw it as an opportunity to overthrow the Assad regime, but in the process, were very aware of the fact that they were creating a jihadi problem that would not be easily solved. Around that time, we also saw the Turks working hand in glove with the Iranians. They actually helped them launder $20 billion or more in Iranian gold and oil proceeds. An astounding number to think about, probably the largest sanctions evasion scheme in modern history. And they were doing this all at the moment that the United States was trying to curb Iran's illicit nuclear ambitions. So this was sanctions busting par excellence. Really remarkable to see a NATO ally engage in this kind of activity. They've brought on the Russian S-400 air defense system, which is a violation of their NATO obligations. And ultimately that led to the United States cutting Turkey out of the F-35 deal, which was a real blow to Turkey's status as a NATO member and as an American ally. And then lastly, just looking at how Turkey relates to Israel. I mean, everybody knows that Recep Tayyip Erdogan is often engaging in vehemently anti-Israel messaging and often anti-Semitic messaging as well. But what people don't realize is that Turkey is right now the second largest Hamas jurisdiction in the world. Gaza, of course, being the first. That's where the largest number of Hamas operatives are, because that's the territory that I don't want to call it sovereign territory, but it's certainly territory that they control. But as a result of years of diplomacy with Hamas and support for Hamas, what we've seen is a large number of senior officials make their way to Turkey. And if you recall, Dore, I'm sure this was something that you dealt with. This is the kidnapping and killing of those 3 teens in the West Bank in 2014. That was planned and coordinated and financed by a guy named Saleh Arori. Arori is one of the more senior officials within the Hamas organization. He took full credit for that attack. That was what really, in public, in front of 1,000 people in Istanbul, including in front of the deputy prime minister of Turkey, and he received a rousing applause. So you get a sense of how popular this is among the Islamists in Turkey and why Erdogan continues down this path. But I would just say, suffice it to say here, that Israel is probably not going to gain a whole lot of ground diplomatically with Erdogan. I think more importantly, the Israelis need to work on ways to hold Turkey to account when wars erupt like the one that just happened last year.
Well, I think you're right. You know, for a period of time when I was serving in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I led an Israeli delegation to Turkey to negotiate the terms of normalization of our relations. And we decided to ask Prime Minister Netanyahu at the time that we demand that the Hamas leadership that sits in Istanbul be evicted. You know, I don't know whether it had been requested in the past, but we made that request. And as a result, Aruri packed his bags. First he went to Qatar, then the Qataris got rid of him and he went to Beirut. So,
and there, Dore, I think it's also important. This gets to another important element that we observed during the war. And this went unnoticed, I think, by most observers during the war. There were 6 rockets that were fired out of Lebanon during that war. Most of them actually hit the Mediterranean, and none of them did any damage to Israel. And it was for that reason that we didn't see an escalation on the northern front. But you have to ask yourself, how did those rockets get there? Who fired them? And there are some open questions about whether they were fired by Palestinians who were looking to drag Israel into a second front in the north. And there, that gets back to a letter that was written by then Ambassador Danny Danon, who was Israel's ambassador to the UN. And he had sent a note in 2018, sent a formal letter in 2018 to the UN, warning that Hamas had been setting up rocket arsenals, rocket launching stations throughout Lebanon with the expressed intent of drawing Israel into a second front during the next Gaza war. And the man responsible for doing that, once again, Saleh Arouri. He did this in coordination with the Iranians and with the Turks out of his base in Lebanon.
Well, I think he knows, we know, and the Turks know that we got onto him. And it's simply illegitimate to talk about a reconciliation, agreement, or understanding while they are trying, or the Turks were trying, to deepen the Hamas connection, Hamas military connection to Turkey. It just doesn't work. There's a lot of other stuff out there that hasn't been revealed yet, but when it does, everyone will understand. But for us to talk about Middle East peace or Middle East stability, the basis of that is going to have to be broader than it was in the past.
Fully agree. Fully agree. And by the way, I'll just note that I've not picked up on, I know that there's an ongoing diplomatic dance right now between Israel and Turkey. I don't actually see a whole lot of progress there. And I certainly don't see the foreign ministry in Israel touting significant achievements. If anything, by the way, Yair Lapid, Israel's foreign minister, has been probably one of the more vocal critics of Turkey under Erdogan. And so it would be very hard to imagine significant concessions taken by the current government in order to pave the way toward broader normalization with the Turks, especially while we continue to see them engage in this kind of activity.
Well, normally when a new government is brought in, world leaders pick up the phone to the new leader and congratulate him. And that's what happened in this case when Erdogan had a phone call with President Herzog after he was installed as Israel's new president. And there have been at least maybe 2-3 phone calls already between the two leaders. And it's something that should be watched. But I don't think that Yitzhak Herzog is anybody's fool. And I don't think he's going to be drawn in for just a photo session in Istanbul or in Ankara with Erdogan. You got to watch out with Erdogan. And I think he knows that.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely agree.
So the Gaza conflict, we get back there because basically we're shadowboxing much larger conflicts that we have exposed. And your book exposes very well. Is there anything else that particularly struck you as you were doing your research for this book that you think people just don't know, but if they did, it would enhance their appreciation of what's going on in the Middle East?
Yeah, I would say that there were a couple of episodes, but maybe before I even get to the episodes, I would say that one issue that drove me crazy was the history of Iranian support for Hamas. And the short shrift that it was given, what I think most people don't think about, and we certainly didn't see much about this in the press at the time, is the sheer amount of assistance that Iran has given Hamas since its inception. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars over the years. We're talking about training, the provision of weapons, including rockets, dating back over a long period of time, the engineering assistance that Iran has given to Hamas engineers to enable them to do it themselves. So in other words, if we didn't see Iran's direct fingerprints on every rocket that was fired during this most recent conflict, there's a reason why. Because, the old adage of, you give a man a fish and they'll be dependent upon you. But if you teach a man to fish, then they can do it for themselves. Iran taught Hamas how to fish with rockets. This is what they taught them to do. And so you didn't see the direct hand of Iran at every step along the way, but there was no earthly possibility that Hamas would have been able to carry out all of the attacks that it did, launching those 4,000 plus rockets without gaining that know-how from Iran. And so that was an important contextual issue that was missing. Now, there were other parts of the war that I found also fascinating in the way that they were covered, in the way that they were discussed. I'll give you a couple of examples, and I'll spend a minute or two on each. The first was the flap that emerged over the initial tweet issued by the IDF saying that they were about to put boots on the ground in the Gaza Strip. Now, if you remember, that sparked a whole series of reports that came out of the AP and Reuters and the New York Times and everything else. And as it turns out, it was a ruse of sorts, that the IDF was trying to message more to Hamas than probably anybody else, that they were going to put boots on the ground. And that's what prompted Hamas to insert its commando fighters into a tunnel system that the Israelis colloquially described as their Hamas metro system. This was a project that took years to develop, hundreds of millions of dollars most likely, and a huge diversion of material assistance that was supposed to go to the people of the Gaza Strip, but never did. Everything went underground with the idea of creating this labyrinth of tunnels where Hamas would be able to pop up and kill or kidnap as many IDF soldiers as possible. The Israelis were well aware of these plans. And so with the announcement that they were going to put boots on the ground, that's when Israel started bombing the metro system and ended up taking out large numbers of Iran-trained fighters. Now, what was really amazing about that, and I've talked about this on a few other discussions, but I turned on Israeli television right as that report came out that there was a ground war taking place. And for anyone who knows Bibi Netanyahu, you know that that's not a risk that Bibi would normally take. This is a man who studied Israeli history, and he's seen the undoing of previous prime ministers, many of whom suffered from quagmires, right? You get into Lebanon, you can't get out of Lebanon, you're stuck, you've lost the war, right? And so I'm thinking, there's no way that Bibi does this. But so I'm watching Channel 11 here from my home in suburban Washington, and there's a reporter who's literally on his phone like this, and he's trying to figure out from his friends in the Kiryat what the hell is going on here, because he doesn't see any fighters behind him, literally right behind him on the Gaza Strip. You could see him standing on the hill overlooking Ashkelon in northern Gaza, and he says, I can't confirm this. So I turn it to Channel 13, same thing. They cannot confirm that there's a ground war. And what was truly remarkable to me was how angry the American press got at the IDF spokesperson, Jonathan Conricus, while at the same time, it became so clear to me that the Israeli media had not fallen prey. And what that showed to me was a disconnect between the Israeli media and the American media. The American reporters simply don't watch what the Israeli reporters are saying and doing what they're reporting. And failure to do that, I think, results in the kind of erroneous coverage that we see coming out of the West on a regular basis. And in my mind, most of these Western reporters had no one but themselves to blame. Had they just simply turned on their television, they would have known that there was no ground war. Now, that's story one. I'll give you one more. And this one, I think, would probably shock a lot of people based on the reporting that they saw in Israel and the United States. Now, during the first 9 days of the war, there was, I think, a lot of really nice compliments given by the Israeli political leadership and the military leadership of Joe Biden. People were saying, the word I heard in Hebrew all the time was gibui, that America had Israel's back, right? This was the word that kept popping up. And you saw it from Benny Gantz to Yair Kochavi to Bibi Netanyahu himself, all saying that Biden truly was blocking anti-Israel efforts at the UN. He was actually deflecting some of the angry stuff that was coming out of members of Congress, and that Israel was able to conduct they don't ever call it a war, of course, you call it an operation, but that Israel was able to conduct the operation with a free hand. Now, on day 9 of the conflict, I noted, actually watching Al Arabiya, that a ceasefire had been tentatively announced, that Egypt had been working behind the scenes for the entire length of the war, and that they appeared to have secured a ceasefire that would go into effect within 48 hours. And this was subsequently confirmed on Israeli television. Now, it was at that moment that I began to see some very strange things here in the US, namely that Biden was going after Bibi. He was saying, there were leaks coming out of the White House saying that he was done screwing around and that it was time for Bibi to end this war. And it was time for Bibi to stop using disproportional force, and that this whole thing had escalated too far and that he was finally going to hold Bibi to account. But in retrospect, it was a blank check that I believe Biden cashed in order to appease the people that we commonly refer to here in the United States as the Squad. These are the members of Congress that I've now come to affectionately describe as the Hamas caucus. Those that we're talking about members of Congress that have tried to actually deplete Israel's Iron Dome stores. We're talking about people that have tried to deprive Israel of its precision-guided munitions, all of the things that have minimized casualties in these conflicts in the past. And here they are, they wanted the president to hammer Israel, and he took that opportunity. It was a cheap political opportunity for him, and yet he did it anyway. And so the lesson that I learned there was that the relationship is, look, largely good, right? That if the president did have Israel's back throughout the conflict, that's a good sign that the president identifies with Israel, understands that Israel's fighting a war that it didn't start, and that it is fighting a terrorist organization that it has every right to vanquish. But on the other hand, if the president feels that he needs to score these political points with the hard left of his party, that actually is probably a bad sign about the political tendencies in this country, where we're heading politically. That is something that I think we're going to have to take a long, hard look at over time.
Well, you know, you just mentioned Israel didn't start the war. One of my researchers who's working on what happened with the Israeli Arabs during the conflict has a speech by Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas leader, in which he said, we, Hamas, started this war. And we are going to publicize that, of course, you know, with a footnote. But unfortunately, the intellectual communities, parts of it in the United States and in Europe, you know, like to pin the blame automatically on Israel without any footnotes. And part of what is really important when you write about the Israeli-Arab conflict, Arab-Israeli conflict, is to present your evidence. And unfortunately, a lot of the reportage is reports without any proof for what they're saying.
You know, Dore, I would add one more note there about the way that these conflicts are described. We often see here in the US that Israel is cast as the aggressor simply by looking at the casualty counts. And that's often a metric. And that metric is obviously extremely misleading for a number of reasons, but primarily, forget about who starts the war, who ends the war. The reason why casualties on the Israeli side are as low as they are is because Iron Dome is incredibly effective. If were it not for Iron Dome, right, then you would probably see an increase on casualties on the Israeli side. But by the way, if Iron Dome also didn't work, then it would probably prompt the Israeli public to engage in some kind of outcry and pushing the IDF for even greater casualties on the Palestinian side as well, on the Gaza side. But at the end of the day, because of Iron Dome, we saw a very, very low number of casualties on the Israeli side. And even if you think about it, the 250 some casualties total that were reported during the war, of course, the vast majority were in Gaza. But when you think about what happened over 11 days of war, 4,000 rockets fired by Hamas and other terrorist groups, and then roughly 2 or even 3 times that fired in response by Israel, the fact that you were able to keep those casualty counts down into the 200s is simply remarkable achievement in precision warfare. And rather than identifying that as really, at the end of the day, of course, we lament every loss of life, but it is a significant achievement to contain the conflict in the way that Israel did. And yet it gets blamed in the way that you just described. And I find that very frustrating, because I do think that the way that Israel fights these wars is exemplary. Especially when they don't want to fight there. Israel has no reason to be warring in Gaza other than from the fact that it is provoked.
Well, you know, this brings me to another topic which is very pertinent today, and that's the United Nations. When I, back around 2010, 2011, I was drawn into the battles that existed at the time with the Goldstone Committee that was established by the UN Human Rights Council. And as you well know, I'm sure the Goldstone Committee made an assertion that had me simply outraged, that Israel deliberately killed Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, deliberately aimed at them, and deliberately destroyed the lives of innocent people. This was completely a falsehood that was spread in a 500-page report with the seal of the United Nations. Now, in the end of the day, about a year after the Goldstone report was published, Goldstone himself retracted and denied his own report's conclusions. But it means we have to be very wary of UN commissions that are sometimes created after various Gaza conflicts. And one that was set up in May of this year by, again, the UN Human Rights Council is planning on setting up a permanent commission to investigate Israel. And it's set up by countries that, for the most part, have zero interest in human rights. They have an interest in trashing Israel, in delegitimizing Israel. Now, that some radical Islamic country or party wants to do that is not a surprise. My concern is when I see Westerners identifying with these countries and pushing with the sort of false democratic majorities in the UN for taking action against the state of Israel when Israel's just defending itself.
Yeah, so, and that commission of inquiry, as I think you've I'm sure observed,
yes.
There are a couple of problems with it. One, beyond the obvious, one is that they are looking to establish proof, and I would put that in air quotes, that Israel is an apartheid state. Of course, that label cannot be applied to Israel in any shape or form. I think an attempt to do so would be tantamount to libel against Israel. But nonetheless, we are seeing that there are other components of it that are also problematic. We're looking at a huge budget, and of course the United States has worked hard to try to reduce some of that budget. But at the end of the day, we're looking at $4 million, a huge amount of staff, all with the goal of vilifying Israel. And of course, there are real questions that I think need to be raised right now about, the United States re-entered the Human Rights Council with the idea that they would be able to reform it from within. That is very much a hypothesis that needs to be tested soon, because right now we're not seeing a whole lot of reform. A 20% reduction in the budget could be described as a step in the right direction, but we're still seeing this process move forward, this commission of inquiry. And so I've got real concerns and real doubts about the wisdom there. I'll just also maybe note as an aside, we did see the UN kind of creep into the May conflict, not through the Commission of Inquiry, and by the way, not through the Security Council because of the measures taken by the Biden administration, again, to their full credit. And I think the Israelis gave the Biden administration credit for having their back at the UN. But what was so interesting to me was actually the aftermath. And Dore, I know you've worked on this issue a lot, but just looking at the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, the agency that is dedicated to perpetuating the Palestinian refugee issue. I wouldn't even call it a crisis. It's an issue. And the reason why it's an issue is because
the status of Palestinians as refugees.
Correct. And what was so interesting about it, and I'm sure you saw, was that the deputy director of UNRWA came out afterwards and actually acknowledged that Israel had fought the war with great precision and that aid continued to flow throughout. And he actually gave Israel some sort of offhand compliments, which I think surprised many. And he was summarily dismissed from his role in the Gaza Strip because he had taken Israel's side, so to speak. But the other thing that came out as a result of the war was that there were tunnels that had been identified by UNRWA as a result of Israeli airstrikes. And they noted that these tunnels went right underneath or right alongside their schools, which has been something that the Israelis have been alleging for years. And UNRWA has denied those allegations. All of a sudden they come clean and say, wait a minute, this is actually happening. And so it was I think it was a damning revelation about what Hamas does in the Gaza Strip, how it engages in a war crime known as human shields. And so I think it opened the door for additional conversations. Whether that leads to reform on the part of UNRWA, I still have significant doubts. And I certainly don't think the UN is going to be changing its broader tune anytime soon. But I thought there were some very interesting revelations, which I addressed in the book.
Well, what you've just demonstrated is that you're hitting all the main points, because this is what war in the Gaza Strip is all about. It's future war. It's wars that you're trying to minimize civilian casualties, and yet you're getting hauled in front of a kangaroo court and being blamed for things you didn't do. That is part of the Gaza conflict. And that is something that people have to hear about, read about, and appreciate, which they can do if they read your book.
Thank you. Yeah, and maybe I'll just add one more thought here, and that is these conflicts are in and of themselves inherently predictable. Like right now, for example, we know that Hamas is amassing its arsenal again. Right? It depleted its arsenal of maybe 15,000 rockets, depleted it by 4,000 during the war. It's trying to get back up to that 15,000 level or perhaps even higher. All the while, the IDF, the Shin Bet, and Israel's Department of Justice is actually collecting what's known as a target bank. There are targets, they are deemed legal by the Israeli bureaucracy, but also according to the laws of war, so that when war does break out, Israel has these targets that they will hit. And by the way, it's important to note that when they start hitting them, in the eventuality of a fifth Gaza conflict, it's not going to be done out of anger. It's going to be done out of rote. I mean, this is muscle memory for the Israeli military right now. They know how this works. When rockets start firing, when a red line is crossed, whether it's firing rockets into Israel's populous Gush Dan area or into Jerusalem, or maybe there's an attack on an IDF outpost, that's what will trigger the next war. And it will not be a so-called response to that. It will be the initiation of new hostilities with Israel's target bank in hand. When that target bank is depleted, and when when Hamas's rockets begin to be depleted, that's usually when the ceasefire conversations begin, the cadence of the war begins to diminish, and then a ceasefire is reached. Once the ceasefire is reached, we're right back to where we are right now, which is the rearming of Hamas and the rebuilding of those target banks. But you can see we are in a vicious cycle. And I hate to call it a cycle of violence, because I think that term is used way too often in the press, and it purports to convey this notion that the Israelis and the Palestinians just They're like Tom and Jerry, that they can't stop fighting each other, right? But the truth of the matter is that Israel would like nothing more than to leave the Gaza Strip alone. It left the Gaza Strip on purpose, right? In 2005, there was no reason for Israel to go back in from its perspective, but yet Hamas continues to fight these wars, not with the idea of winning, but with the idea of dragging Israel into yet another conflict in which the stakes get progressively higher. They're still not a strategic threat to Israel, but they still like the idea of drawing Israel into conflict, watching how they respond to various military maneuvers, perhaps to be able to convey to the Iranians or Hezbollah what Israeli tactics might be in broader conflicts in the future. But these things are very, very predictable. And it's amazing to me that the analysts of this particular conflict, the reporters that cover this conflict, are not aware of the cyclical nature, the very clear characteristics of these conflicts.
One thing you write about in your book is the El Jalal Tower, and that whole story. It combines a lot of drama because you have there the press is involved, Al Jazeera is involved, and Qatar is involved for that matter. And I'd like you to share with your audience a little bit about the whole El Jalal Tower story, so that, first of all, let them buy the book and get to that section and read it. But it's a demonstration of how far the other side goes to make our lives miserable and try to test our morality because they want to force us into striking civilian targets.
Yeah, so it was definitely one of the more dramatic moments of the war. You'll recall that, on Israeli TV, and I think even to a certain extent American TV, we saw the implosion of this building in the Gaza Strip on repeat, right? The video was just being shown for hours on end. It was a dramatic strike at the end of the day. But the story is actually much more complicated than Israel just deciding that it was time to bomb a building, which you don't often see Israel do in these conflicts. But the story begins with Israel making the decision that it's going to destroy the building because there was some kind of office in there that was maintained by Hamas, and that there was some technology that was being used that was endangering Israeli lives. That was kind of the initial report. So what does Israel do? Well, first they call the owners of the building and tell them that they're going to vacate, that they need to vacate the building because Israel is going to bomb it. At which point the owners go floor to floor and tell everybody to get out of the building. On top of that, the Israelis use a technology, which I still find amazing, where they're able to contact all the cell phones within the given structure, and they tell them in Arabic to get out before the building is destroyed. So now these people have had 2 warnings. Then on top of that, the Israelis drop what's known as a knock-knock bomb. It's a small explosive that will shake the building and warn the occupants that a strike is in fact about to come. So then the entire building is vacated. It's at that point that the Israelis strike the tower, destroy it. And if you watch the video, it actually looked like it was imploding from within. You didn't see sort of a big mushroom cloud. So really the explosives that were used, the munitions that were used actually helped cut down on the amount of damage that would be incurred in the rest of the neighborhood. Now, at the moment that happens, Israel comes under a huge amount of fire. I think not surprisingly. It's the building that houses the AP, Associated Press, as well as Al Jazeera. And Israel begins to be blamed for trying to curb the coverage of the Gaza war. So the implication here is that Israel is actually trying to obfuscate what the journalists would otherwise uncover, and that is seen as an anti-press move. And so you see a bunch of NGOs come out and condemn Israel. Israel, what's that?
The hyenas.
Yes, the hyenas come out. And so Israel finds itself on the defensive. But what it does actually is it takes the intelligence that it had and it demonstrates to the Biden administration why it targeted this particular building. As it turns out, there was a Hamas office that was running an electronic warfare kit that was trying to disrupt or jam Iron Dome. And this would have had really a catastrophic impact on the course of the war had they been successful. because, of course, rockets would start to land inside Israel proper. You would see greater numbers of casualties on the Israeli side, which would then prompt the Israelis to strike back harder inside the Gaza Strip, perhaps without the kind of surgical care that they had demonstrated up until that point in the war. And so it could have been a very ugly turning point. Instead, they disabled it, and I think they were able to continue to conduct the war as initially planned. What was fascinating about this on two fronts for me was the two media outlets that were in the building. First, let's just talk about AP for a minute. If you go back and look, there was a fascinating article written by Mati Friedman, who's a Canadian-Israeli journalist. He's been in Israel for a long time. And he noted back in 2006 in The Atlantic that AP had a kind of a policy of turning a blind eye to Hamas activity inside the Gaza Strip. And the reason was, of course, is that Hamas is a terrorist organization and they set the rules. And if you're a law-abiding media organization, you need to be careful not to upset those that are giving you their hospitality in a jurisdiction like the Gaza Strip. And so there was a sort of a track record already of AP kind of maybe looking the other way. Now, whether they did so or not here, we don't know. I don't expect that there was, on floor 8, I didn't expect to see like a Hamas sign saying like Hamas warfare unit in the Jala Tower. I think that is probably a bit outlandish. But if you're a reporter, if you're an investigative reporter, and you're not looking at the fact that there could be a Hamas office right under your nose, maybe you're not doing your job well enough. And I think that there are some legitimate questions that can be raised. But the other part of it, which I found also interesting, is that Al Jazeera, right? They're the other ones who cried foul from all of this, saying that they were being obstructed from doing their job. But Al Jazeera, we may recall, is owned entirely by the government of Qatar. And the government of Qatar is one of the top financial sponsors of Hamas. So these guys are not exactly, or fair arbiters of this conflict. They're not exactly reporting without bias. And in fact, what we've seen in the past is that the United States government and Qatar have squared off in places like Afghanistan and Iraq because Al Jazeera happens to show up 3-4 minutes in advance of attacks against American personnel. And that was happening on a regular basis to the point that the then Bush administration, fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, leveled significant complaints at the government of Qatar, and actually even targeted some of Al Jazeera's offices as a result of their suspicion of terrorist activities. And just to put a bow on it, when the war was over, there was a sort of a famous photo that came out where the leadership of Al Jazeera was paid a visit by some of the leadership of Hamas. And Hamas gave Al Jazeera an award for their exemplary coverage of the 2021 Gaza conflict, just to give you a sense of the relationship that exists between these two entities.
Well, that also means that those of us who are condemned right now to have to fight these conflicts to protect our civilians are going to have to learn the lessons of a war like the Gaza conflict in order to avert the same thing occurring to their armed forces. And I wouldn't be surprised, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if CENTCOM has a unit that does precisely that, talks to the IDF about what the IDF learned in the Gaza conflict. Again, I don't know if that exists. If it doesn't, it should. And if it does, let it continue.
And as you know, Israel just recently joined CENTCOM, just joined the rest of the Middle East in engaging with this particular command structure. And so my sense anyway is that, yes, they are trying to learn lessons. But of course, these are not lessons that are new. CENTCOM has fought against Iran-backed forces in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. So there are patterns that can be discerned. Of course, the Israelis, I think, face these battles on a more regular basis. And often are seen as innovators in this space. But I don't believe the United States is stranger to all of this. Of course, we've since left Afghanistan. That's no longer a hot zone for us. Iraq is much less of a hot zone than it used to be. But I think the threat of Iran-backed forces, Iranian proxies, remain. And it's certainly not a threat only to the Israelis, but to all of the countries in the CENTCOM region, as well as the United States, to the extent that it chooses to be involved.
That's correct. Well, I have to say, this has been a real pleasure having this exchange. And you wrote a great book, and I hope people read it. I think you have to find, the name of the game is marketing books today. I remember when I wrote 4 New York Times bestsellers back in the first decade of this century. And I learned all the tricks of the trade, how to increase sales. In any event, it's very important that you get your message out, and anything we can do to help you, it'd be our pleasure to do that.
Well, thank you. And I thank you for the opportunity to chat today, and hope to do so again.